I think something that has really helped my analytical skills has been diversifying my review pool. During the initial onset of the pandemic, I just kind of figured I'd start reviewing Gojama Jodoremi since I had a little extra time on hand. Since then, I've been able to figure out a groove that's let me work my day job, whilst also throwing in an extra review every Wednesday. From there, we later added in Powerpuff Girls Z, and do have plans to cover some non-magical girl series that I really do want to talk about later this year if the stupid site will let me. Still, what I'm trying to say is that having started to review other stuff, in particular PPGZ, I think I've become a little more sensitive to stuff like creator's intent, which I do try to work more into my reviews. Having actually looked into stuff like PPTZ, I've been able to recognize that they weren't trying to make any sort of high art or even match up with its source material. They just wanted to make their own fun, quote-unquote erotic cool Elseworlds take on the girls, which, going in with that mindset, I have been able to enjoy it a lot more, in spite of also recognizing its objective low qualities. Thus, while I'm certainly not going to significantly change my opinions on previous series, I can at least grade a little more on a curve, I think. Like, having got to know Jin Tanaka's more trolly nature, I can get more of an ironic enjoyment out of stuff like Kira Kira Precure a la mode. It doesn't save that show from being an unfocused mess in my opinion, but at the same time, I am able to appreciate the final arc a little more and its over-the-top references to the bad guys from World War II. I mean, come on, how can you not laugh at that? If anything, I'll give the staff credit for throwing caution to the wind at that point and purposely going for so bad it's good territory, which, yes, was a similar feeling I got by the end of this series, for better and for worse. But yeah, it was clear that from the very beginning, this season went in with the intent of making a much lighter and softer season after the hellscape that was 2020. And while I certainly don't think it succeeded as well as, say, another series that immediately followed a major disaster and fumbled in many key areas of its story, I still think I liked it in the long run, as for the most part, it stayed in its lane of its original good intent. Moreover, when they did try to do something different, some of it was quite successful, and even the failures were total busts that got me legitimately frustrated like other shows I've watched, not just Precure. This was helped by the fact that they did change things up a lot behind the scenes, bringing in people I honestly would have never imagined seeing working on a toy project, much less Precure. Thus, in general, I would call this season an interesting experiment that, while unable to produce great results, still succeeded in some. Still, let's just do this little overview of Tropical Rouge Precure and try and figure out how much island spirit they managed to work into their show, which honestly doesn't amount to much. In fact, I think we kind of side with the villains in that regard. Okay, so let's just address this right off the bat. For a season that was supposed to be more laid back, Toei brought in some pretty serious names, in particular for the writer's room. Series composition for this one was led by Masahiro Yokotani, who, while probably best known for head writing all 3 seasons of Re:Zero, I've personally been more of a fan of his comedy work from Maria Holic, The Devil is a Part-Timer, looking forward to season 2 by the way, and Shimoneta. For me, I really like his style of comedy, as I think he understands that good laughs come from building fleshed out and expressive characters first and foremost. I mean, let's face it, as ridiculous as Satan working at McDonald's might sound, it wouldn't have been nearly as funny if we hadn't gotten to know the character and seen how far he had fallen from his position as the final boss of your typical JRPG. Helps that they built some good character drama between him and the female hero that he had allegedly killed the father of, but that'll be more relevant to these discussions later. The point is that I have been a fan of his writing, as he often puts his characters first. With that in mind, I also wasn't expecting a whole lot of complicated world building, at least from him, as that's not his forte. For that, you could have expected the secondary writers to pick up the slack, but like Killing Good before, there were at least some writing vets to likely back up the new kid in charge, with longtime writers Isao Murayama and Minori coming back after a surprising stint of absence. And for the most part, I'd say they did their usual thing. Murayama did some great world-building episodes and arguably one of the best episodes of the season, while Narita provided her usual zany antics, which, to be fair, did fit well with this season. I wouldn't say they were completely on their game. In fact, in the case of the former, in spite of writing one of the best episodes, I think he also wrote one of the worst episodes of the season, but at the same time, they didn't take much away from this series, and again, kind of just did their own thing. Miu Inoue could also count as a vet, though she was gone for an even longer time, and didn't leave that much of a great impression after she left. That said, I would say her batch of episodes were very solid, and even provided some of the best comedy of the series. So, overall, I would say the vets did their job by not intruding on Yokotai's vision, whilst also providing some support with some good pillar episodes to build off of. However, like any season really, there was a weak link who couldn't quite build off of the works of others. I'm sorry, but I just don't think Konomi Shugo was ready to write for this franchise. She might become better later, especially after landing a series composition credit for In the Heart of Kunoichi Tsubaki, but for now at least, her writing was just kind of bland. Not really bad, but also not taking full advantage of something like a bi-switch episode of all things. Something like that should lead to comedy gold, and yet it was played so straightforward that another non-canon short from a later episode was infinitely better. And really, I don't want to have to keep complaining about this one writer, since it's not her fault that she was thrown into the deep end, but I kind of have to when she was given 7 episodes to write for. The second most amount of episodes for this series, tied with a vet like Isao Murayama of all people. I believe this was done for budgetary reasons, as there was one more writer who really could have been a difference maker if they had been given more episodes, but knowing Toei, they decided to not use them and just go with the cheaper newbie. I'll save talking about that writer when we get more into the episode summaries, but for now, let's move on to other aspects of the production staff, like the voice cast, which, yeah, I'll just say was pretty damn near perfect. Often with this franchise, they will use some combination of newbies and veterans, with the hopes that the former will be able to learn on the job, but with this cast though, 4 out of the 5 were pretty much established names. A couple of them support Shield Hero, another is the best girl from Kaguya-sama, don't at me, and the last one is one of the best saber faces ever. Hell, even Manatsu's VA, while relatively the least experienced, also had been making a name for herself even before landing the role of Jolene Kujo in the middle of this season. Fun fact, Aimi Tanaka, the voice of Umaru Doma, had originally auditioned for the role of Manatsu, but ultimately chose to play Kun after she saw the design. Yeah, I wonder if she regrets that choice. I mean, it's certainly a pity that we missed out on our main heroine sounding like this. Regardless, the voice cast for this show was all around one of the strongest in the franchise, and I would say with maybe the exception of one, they used them to their full abilities. Likewise, while not quite as good as her work on Healing Good, at least in my opinion, Shiho Terada still did some great work for the OST of this show. So in general, the season sounded great, so did it also look great? Well, yeah, overall, I would say it looked pretty good. We got Yukiko Nakatani of Gold Princess fame coming back to do character designs and even animating a few episodes. We also got a decent blend of veteran animators like Ken Ueno and Nishiki Itoka doing more than their fair share of anime direction, whilst also bringing in some talented new blood into the franchise like Keisuke Mori, don't worry, we'll get to his episode soon enough. Though for me, the most surprising new hires were Nogyo Bo and Kenichi Hara, a couple of big names from Studio Gallop who were best known for animating Yu-Gi-Oh! Up until 7s. If at all possible, I'd like to imagine that they were just the first of the Gallop alumni to work on this franchise, especially now that they're not getting any more work from a certain card game IP. Because if we never get faces like this in anime ever again, then I will just quit the medium. But yeah, this along with a lot of talented key animators like Yu Yoshiyama made this one of the most unique looking seasons to say the least, if not outright amazing at times. So in general, I would say the season had an overall great staff and crew. So were they able to put together a season to match up with all that promise? Kind of. Alright, so when I initially went into this series, I was totally expecting a season with more character focus than world building, which I was totally fine with, as we all kind of needed something a little bit more lighthearted after 2020. And Toei does have a history of doing similar tonal shifts with stuff like Car Ranger, and more appropriately for this video, Smile Precure, which, yeah, I do expect a few comparisons with this season. But yeah, definitely from the first quarter of the season, from about episodes 1 to 13, I definitely got that feeling, more so in some ways. The first 5 episodes gave us fairly even characterization for our main heroines, one of whom we really didn't know would be the Sixth Ranger of the team, unless you're an impatient Nancy and spoiled yourself, but still, we appreciated Laura as the very helpful support character. She would end up becoming a little too helpful later, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Point is, everyone had decent to really good intro episodes that even managed to plant a few clever seeds for future developments. Granted, some would bloom better than others, but there I go again, getting ahead of myself. No, and they also introduced the mascot character of the season, Kurun, in episode 7, and they added pretty much nothing to the entire season, as Laura already fulfilled most of the usual duties of a fairy, and probably could have easily been written out, and nothing would have been gained or lost, really. I mean, at least the episode they debuted in was kind of fun, especially thanks to all of the Jacker references, which, yeah, I can kind of appreciate, but again, my condolences go to Aimi Tanaka. So the thing that really made our main heroine stand out were those amazing finishers. While I personally think some were better than others, there's no arguing that they were all very unique and creative, with each of them even having their own different animator, as though this were Symphogear XV, with each animator getting to do the transformation sequence of their personal waifus. Though thankfully no pole dancing, because this is a kid's show. Thus, it was a bit of a pity when their usage took a massive downturn after the introduction of their first group finisher, though in hindsight, I'll admit the Mixed Tropical was probably my favorite group finisher of the season, if only because it wasn't too absurd. I mean, it is just a giant chicken. Either that or the giant claw, as one of my commenters pointed out. Speaking of which, the 10th episode where it debuted was probably my favorite episode of this part of the series, as not only did it have some of the better animation of the whole show directed by frickin' Ken Ueno, but it was also the first episode written by Yoshimi Narita. It was arguably her best episode, which honestly isn't that much of a hard choice, as she only unfortunately got 4 episodes. Granted, part of that might be because she was also writing the movie of the season, so they probably didn't want to overload her plate like they kind of did with Happiness Charge, good god. But it is still a shame that the writer, known for her comedy, couldn't contribute more to this season, which, yeah, we'll get to that. She's also known for adding a certain something else into her scripts a lot, but more on that later. Most importantly, she did add some interesting developments that could be built off of. I mean, I've heard mixed feelings on making Manatsu totally book dumb in this episode, as yeah, it is a bit of an overused cliche in this franchise, which an OG writer like Narita would probably emphasize. But I still like the idea of Manatsu being unable to choose what she wanted to focus on, which was even a major issue when they were originally forming the Tropical Club, and by the end they never did pick out a proper curriculum. In a way, you could argue that sort of indecisiveness was a form of laziness, as Manatsu even became a victim of the motivation-draining monster of the week as a karmic result. Thankfully, she also later apologized for troubling her friends, which definitely earned her a few points in my book. The other major standout of that episode was the subplot of Chonge's growing frustrations with the witch refusing to eat his cooking, which is a very understandable plight for a chef, especially when a certain stand user, Seahorse, seemed to be gaslighting him. I was really hoping that we would get some sort of follow-up to this, like Chonge would become a more dangerous antagonist, like Wolford, especially as the big bad second-in-command kept egging him on, but nope. The remaining 3 episodes were okay. The most interesting and entertaining development was Laura discovering that she could hide amongst the humans in plain sight as long as she wore a long skirt to cover up her tail. This was especially good for her, as she was starting to come down with a case of the aerials.
Wish I could be part of that.
Thus, we enter into the second quarter of the series from about episodes 14 to 26, and what I consider to be the weakest part of the series, which is a shame because it also has one of the strongest episodes, not just of this season, but also for the whole franchise, at least from the visual storytelling standpoint. As I said, the first quarter basically ended with Laura longing to be a part of their world and all that jazz, which was culminated in episode 16, where the Little Mermaid's feelings of inferiority really started to pile up. It was a good development showing how this once, and okay, still kind of haughty mermaid, realized that she actually wanted to live more amongst the surface dwellers, who she had once seen as nothing more than pawns in her bid towards queendom. And yet, because of her very nature as a mermaid, she literally couldn't stand alongside them, at least not for a long time and mostly on flat surfaces. This was all brilliantly visually told to us, and while not every episode building towards this was great in my opinion, there's no denying that the setup was good. Though, as for the actual payoff of Laura becoming La Mer, I mean, I've already expressed my personal feeling that they really didn't need to make her the Sixth Ranger of the team, and while I'm probably in the minority about that, I think a lot more of us can agree that, in hindsight, the way Laura went about gaining her powers wasn't completely satisfying. In episode 16, it was hinted that Laura would have to submit to the laws of equivalent exchange if she wanted to acquire legs, much like the other fish lady they kept bringing up. And yet, not only did that never really come to pass, she didn't even have to give up her mermaidhood like Ariel, but it didn't even really feel like that big of a struggle for her to get her new toy. Part of that might have been because the threat that the witch and her cronies had posed had been poorly built up, which we'll get more into later, though it also felt more than a little rushed, as after being KO'd by Butler, Laura was just kind of in front of the Grand Ocean Queen in the next scene, as suddenly Kurun had become useful. From there, Queen just gave her the transformation trinket, which we'll also talk more about later, as that's also kind of problematic in its own right, and then she saved the day and legs. So, yeah, what was that about sacrifices, Minori? I don't know, just compared to the journeys that many other Six Rangers had to go through where they ended up questioning their very morality or even upbringing, this didn't feel quite as satisfying in my opinion. Nothing really bad, which is something I've been saying throughout this review, but also it did feel a little too overly convenient at times, and even worse in hindsight. From there, we got the requisite Six Ranger establishment episodes, which were pretty good overall, I mean, at least compared to the previous season's equivalent. Sure, they weren't stellar episodes, and again, one in hindsight gets a lot worse when we look at the endgame of the show, but at least it really wasn't the fault of the character. Still, the remainder of this quarter were some very middling filler episodes with varying degrees of entertainment. This wouldn't have been a big deal if we had gotten some decent character spotlighting for everyone who wasn't the main protagonist or deuteragonist, but even though some episodes seemed like they had the setup for them, they ended up being like Manatsu in the 10th episode, and focused on superfluous elements rather than what actually was important, our main character. And unfortunately, we also got one of the worst episodes of the season. Surprisingly though, it wasn't because of the guest star comedian, who while he certainly isn't going to win any awards anytime soon, he was at least leagues better than his alumni who made Professor Leskinen from Steins Gate Zero seem legit.
Holy cow! So I said we should come soon.
But yeah, the real problem of this episode was the fact that they were mostly just retreading some plot points from the Asuka Yuriko subplot, and while I thought that was actually one of the best stories to come out of this season, this episode did nothing to really advance it, and also it had some of the worst jokes of the season. I mean, sure, comedy is subjective, but if you're still laughing at banana peel pratfalls in the 2020s, then I do have to question your sense of humor. And unfortunately, this was written by Isao Murayama, who really needs to stick to his excellent world building, because if this is his idea of comedy... That's the joke. Well, at least his next episode is gonna be great. With that in mind, we move on to the best quarter of the season, bar none in my opinion, from about episodes 27 to 37. Sure, they were still plagued by many of the same issues of the previous quarter, with maybe one too many forgettable filler episodes, but at least we were getting a few actually legit spotlight episodes for characters other than these two. We'll discuss these more when we get around to talking about the characters individually, but still, it really did feel like this was the part of the series where they tried to get things back on track, especially thanks to a couple of episodes. No, not these two, or at least not to me personally, but sure, let's talk about them. Not only was the Sakuga of episode 29 on the same legendary tier of many films in this franchise, but it was overall better looking than the corresponding film of the year. Granted, the Snow Princess film was on the lower tier of production value for a film in this franchise, but the point still stands. It was just an excellent showcase for animators like Masami Mori, Shunsuke Okubo, Yu Yoshiyama, and Kodai Watanabe. Jeez, we haven't seen you in a while. But yeah, while it was clear that they were just going all out for the sake of pushing a brand new toy, there's no denying that they did more than a good job here. Moreover, they were at least nicely building towards some future developments in the show.
Though, as for the payoffs, well, we'll get to those when we get into the final quarter.
The other very memorable episode that managed to take up a couple more entries on Sakuga Boru was episode 33. Though unlike 29, this was technically total filler that could have easily been skipped, as right off the bat they even established that it was non-canon. And yet, why would you ever want to do that, as this was outright one of the most entertaining episodes of the entire series. It was essentially an anthology episode with 11 segments, though 2 of them were connected, so it was kind of 10, but whatever, semantics. Each segment had a different animation style, which not too surprisingly was a hell of an endeavor behind the scenes to organize, but as a result, we not only got one of the most creative episodes ever, but we also just got to enjoy these characters and their personalities. My personal favorite was the Body Switch 2.0 segment, as we really got to appreciate how distinctive these characters' personalities are when they're not in their proper shells. Also, because they didn't needlessly switch around voices this time, Sango's VA, Yumi Hanamori, really got to show off her range. Seriously, this lady does some of her best work when given the free range that this sort of pop team epic episode gives her. Thus, while I could complain that this was a total waste of an episode, as the story was kind of stalling by this point, this also did feel like what the show was initially selling itself as, a fun and legit hilarious series that did not need to rely on banana peels.
That said, it also wasn't totally disconnected from the main conflict, as I was able to, at least accidentally, tie it back to it through one of my random ramblings of one of the segments. Well, okay, this could lead to some interesting world building, like maybe there were some relationships between the Grand Ocean and the surface world, but then there was some sort of falling out that might even lead to the creation of the witch, and you're not even listening, you just want to watch the funny stuff, don't you? Hey, what can I say? I'm just psychic.
With that in mind, let's finally address the 2 episodes that I really want to talk about, and what I consider to be the most important part of this series, as it had left me very split about the season in general. Episodes 36 and 37 were a 2-parter, and yet they were written by 2 different writers. The latter was done by head writer Yoko Tani, and the former was done by one of my favorite anime screenplay writers ever, Hiryoyuki Yoshino.
I said the writer, not the voice actor.
Now, Yoshino had actually written 3 episodes before this, and they were just okay. I mean, it was clear that the guy was getting his feet wet into the franchise he had never written for until now, and he certainly did a good job fleshing out characters like Elda and Minori, whilst also writing some entertaining slice-of-life stories, which he does often, though really, that stuff is more often in service of his real bread and butter.
Yeah, when I heard Yoshino was writing for this franchise, I could only think of one thing. Well, okay, maybe 2 things.
But yeah, if you're not familiar with his work, Hiryoyuki Yoshino is arguably the master of the mood whiplash. He knows how to lure his viewers into a false sense of security before he yanks the chain really hard and brings them back to cruel reality with a lot of blatant social commentary about the hardships that come with growing up in a country that still has some very backwards thinking politics. One of the best examples of this was the aforementioned My Hime, a magical girl franchise aimed at an older audience.
So yeah, if you think the Butcher is the insane sadist for what he did with Madoka Magica, he still is, but this dude is the OG.
But yeah, he would also go on to series comp some of my favorite anime of all time, whilst also secondary writing other things where he would pull his old tricks again. Seriously, just take a wild guess as to what one of the episodes he wrote for Konkole was. As long as they're even slightly magical, suffering is for everyone. But I digress. One of my favorite series of all time is Code Geass, and while I certainly wasn't expecting anything of that magnitude to play out in Precure of all things, I was expecting some sort of dark twist, which we certainly got when it was revealed that the Grand Ocean had a freaking Lotus Eater machine in their basement. And while it wasn't meant to be primarily used as a matrix, it had been used a lot as a mind blower, which just makes me wonder if Mr. Nimbus had hooked them up with Rick Sanchez. But yeah, this was definitely a Yoshino twist, revealing that once trustworthy authority figure was far from being on the up and up, and was manipulating the memories of not just her people, but as we learned from the final episode, remotely removing the memories of some, not all surface dwellers. Yeah, don't worry, we'll address that stuff too. Regardless, it was a really good twist, and the first time in a long while, if ever really, a Precure questioned a person of authority, because yeah, if you own anything that has the Rick Sanchez seal of approval, then you should be considered to be in the darkest of gray areas.
So, what did they do with this groundbreaking revelation that not only brought into question why they were fighting for this factious kingdom, but also generated a lot of personal drama for Laura and Manatsu being victims of this very machine?
Nothing.
Well, not exactly nothing, but yeah, also not all that satisfying either.
Jumping ahead a little here, but this plotline only really got brought up in the final episode and a half of the show, and needless to say, all of the deeper themes of questioning moralities and confronting the previous generations and their dangerously archaic beliefs that wouldn't feel out of place in a Code Geass script, yeah, pretty much all dropped, even though they seemed like they were going in those directions. As a result, the final arc that we'll get to in just a bit was a mess of a story with a lot of plot holes to be found. And it's a real shame because this really does feel like a plotline that they wanted to do. As I said, the two-part was written by Yoshino and Yoko Tani, which tells me that they had at least agreed on this, and judging by both men's works, they seem like they were compatible. Hell, they've even worked together on stuff like Axel World.
So of course, the question now is, how did we end up here? Well, there's probably a plethora of reasons, really.
First, let's consider one of the most common reasons a storyline like this would be dropped. It was too dark, especially for a more lighthearted series like this.
In some ways, I could understand that. Hell, knowing Yoshino, I wouldn't at all be surprised if his original scripts might have taken things a little too far.
I mean, I love the guy's work, but I also know for a fact that he doesn't bat 100 every time, and does fall into the trap of trying to recapture the magic of Code Geass a little too much sometimes. That said, it's not as though this franchise has shied away from darker stuff even after something really bad happened. Yeah, in spite of its title, when you really get down to it, Smile had some of the most intense scenes of the franchise.
Now personally, I wouldn't call it a dark season or anything, but they did tackle some deeper themes like dealing with loss and depression, the latter especially, and it will become more relevant for this season in just a bit.
Or hell, for a more direct example, they have tackled tales of dystopias, which yes, the Grand Ocean does qualify as, when the ruling party insists on having a Ministry of Truth. On a side note, that's probably one of my biggest issues with this plotline essentially being dropped. The Queen is a total Karma Houdini. No matter what the reason, be it for the greater good, she still forcibly altered everyone's minds, including Laura when she was just a child. In many ways, she's not that much better than Mobius, but yet again, this franchise fails to call out significant authority figures. I would almost say Toei has an aversion to this stuff, and yet the show that played right before it, Kamen Rider Revice, has a major ongoing subplot where the protagonists have to constantly question whether or not the government-funded organization they work for is also fighting for the greater good.
I'm just saying, if Transformers Cyberverse can get away with doing this storyline, then I don't see why Precure can't. And yeah, also have the better toy line.
My point is that while it might have played a factor based on their past and present behavior, I doubt Toei would just completely reject a Yoshino script based on how dark it was, especially after they had paid the guy. But therein lies the more likely reason why this plotline, as well as a few others, were dropped.
Obviously, I can't say for sure, but just based off the production values of their corresponding film, I do feel like Toei might have reduced the show's budget significantly after seeing the disappointing returns of their first financial quarter, and they wanted to avoid a similar situation like they did with Gold Princess, where they ended up overpaying for a show with low returns.
As a result, and in spite of a lot of things likely already being in the oven, I think many last-minute changes and cuts had to be made, which led to the plot falling off the rails in the final arc of the series.
And if you think Toei would never screw over a show that's well into its production, oh sweet child, let me introduce you to a little something called Kamen Rider Hibiki.
And in fact, I think some of the effects of these change-ups could be seen in the tail end of this arc, as after having lost their new power-up that they had spent a whole episode looking for, only to have it taken away at the last minute, and stored deep within the lair of their enemy, how did our heroines go about retrieving it whilst also dealing with their newer, stronger enemy type?
What the fudge pickle?
Ichigo Kurosaki is looking at y'all and saying, you got off way too easy.
Thus, we entered into the final quarter of the series from episodes 38 to 46. And conveniently, it's easy enough to break down what the episodes were about and who wrote what. The first three acted as essentially conclusions to the arcs of the other three, as we'll just call them at this point, which were handled by Murayama, Yoshino, and Narita respectively. The 41st episode was a clip show, and the final five were essentially the grand finale to the series, as well as to Laura and Manatsu's arc, because the two are pretty much joined at the hip.
We're like brothers, only closer.
Now, on paper, and in isolation, this actually might sound like a very well mapped out concluding arc for the series, but putting aside some of my thoughts about the individual character resolutions, the plot here was very poorly built up.
Now again, when I went into the series, I wasn't expecting anything deep and probably wouldn't have minded too much, and yet they kind of insisted on throwing in a plot with themes I really like, so I do have to be kind of judgmental.
Hell, even if I weren't, I would still say there are some fundamental issues with these episodes.
Now, the grand finale did start off decently enough with Azora being attacked by supposedly the strongest Yaneda ever that was quickly taken out in the following episode. Though, honestly, underwhelming fights were probably the least of this finale's problems, as best emphasized in the following two episodes, where it was clear that they were making a hell of a mad dash to try and wrap things up. This included telling Queenie's backstory that raised a lot more questions than answers, like why was she unable to become a precure unlike her successor? Why did she hide the grail full of motivation energy rather than trying to return it to its owners, along with a significant power-up that might have been useful to our heroines? In fact, why didn't she ever tell Laura about it, especially after she gave her a pack believing that she'd turn into a precure? Oh, and one last little thing, who the holy hell is this Mazinger knockoff? They look pretty intimidating, and yet we never really learned what became of them. I personally assumed they were going to be like the evil force behind the witch, or disguised as a certain sus seahorse, but nope. They didn't really play into anything, so I'm just gonna assume they turned into Mikintan or something.
You see what I mean? In just this one scene, we're now suddenly left with a ton of unanswered questions, and we haven't even gotten into the backstory of the witch and the legendary cure.
Like, okay, it's not as though there are a ton of logical fallacies here, but in my opinion, it lacked a significant emotional attachment for the audience, again, due to the poor build-up. I mean, sure, there were a lot of moments when the witch thought about Annette, and yet because they had kept things so vague, it was hard to gain any sort of attachment to this villainess, who, as we learned, was going through the mourning process. Yeah, as it turned out, her whole being lazy shtick was likely her constantly cycling through the first four stages of grief. Denial, anger, bargaining, and depression, but never reaching the final stage of acceptance.
Just by that description, you would think that the witch is one of the deepest, tragic villains in this franchise, and yet it's kind of hard to feel that when a lot of this is just being dumped onto us in 2 episodes, when really, subject matter like this needs at least some sort of mini arc in order to flesh out.
And this is where I theorize a lot of the plans for the show got cut. To me, we really should have got to at least a few episodes dedicated to recounting Annette and the witch's past. It would have made the final parting between the two so much more impactful if we had actually gotten to know the characters, rather than rush through things with a montage that was more laughable than anything.
明日にするわ。
今日こそは。
いや、明日にしよう。
Oh well, I guess we'll try again tomorrow.
It also could have had the added benefit of addressing a lot of the show's other narrative issues.
One of the commenters brought up a very interesting idea that they could have had play out like a super condensed version of Kamen Rider Kiva's format by switching between the past and present storylines.
In that show, it was often used to explain certain developments, like how did this one transformation trinket come about, or how did this plot convenient sword end up where it did when the protagonist needed it. Imagine if they had done stuff like that for the Queen's Pact or the Marine Ring, while also telling the tale of the young maiden and the Sea Witch. All of a sudden, a lot of my previous complaints are addressed, and this final arc would flow a lot better. 1, we would circumvent a lot of these exposition dumps that killed the pace. 2, it would fill up some major plot holes, like maybe Annette was the one who defeated this guy. And 3, and most importantly, it would have led to some much needed world building for the Grand Ocean, which was barely featured in this show at all. In the penultimate episode, we learned that this budget Atlantis could move, which, yeah, is kind of a big thing, and would explain how they've remained separated from the surface world even after making contact.
Also, yeah, knowing one of the writers, I wouldn't at all be surprised if this was supposed to be like some sort of social commentary on Japan's isolationist past and even kind of their present. But there's the thing, they would have had to pay Yoshino more for his scripts, which I don't think they were willing to do.
In total, Yoshino only wrote 5 episodes for this show, the second least amount after Narita, which is a shame because there were still some flashes of brilliance here, like with the reveal that mermaids have much longer lifespans than humans, and that apparently this is why the race had chosen the isolation route. It's a trope I really like, and even kind of tied back to all that Urashima Taro stuff from episode 33 that was revealed to us within the last few minutes of the show.
Again, while I don't have any solid evidence to prove this, it really does feel like a lot of the stuff in the middle of this plot line is missing.
Hell, the very fact that Annette had pretty much a full transformation sequence tells me that they had been working on something, but because the higher-ups didn't want to pay for stuff like writers, probably more VAs, and new backgrounds and settings, it was cut and replaced with stuff like clip shows and a lot more focus on superfluous school episodes.
Some have said this series could have been vastly improved with more episodes, but I have to kind of disagree.
They probably had just the right amount of episodes, and even made the plot-focused ones had some of the best pacing in the franchise, but when you're not given the resources you need to complete a major plot point, well, what can you do?
No, what the heck, I'll laugh anyway.
Seriously, the final few episodes really did feel like an overly long joke with how rushed it felt, topped off with Annette, the character whom we just had this whole tragic plotline with. Act like Rena Ryugu if she were on the worst kind of Omochikari high. And in a way, I can kinda respect them for just not giving a crap at this point.
Seriously, while that last minute poop joke was juvenile, if that was Yokotai's last little middle finger to Toei for not letting them do the show they wanted to, then I want to buy that man a beer.
But yeah, the season ended with an epilogue that again had some good moments like the play and the farewells to Laura, but also opened up the biggest plot hole at the very end of the series, no less. As it turned out, the memory machine could not only work remotely on humans, but also erase all evidence of them ever making contact with them. You know, other than the village elder, who could still vividly recount her seeing the young queen, or Manatsu when she originally met Laura. In fact, how truly thorough can it be if legends of mermaids are just as, if not more prevalent in this world? It would actually make sense as they did make contact, but yeah, how is it that Hans Christian Andersen's tale even exists in this world?
It just don't add up!
So yeah, I didn't much care for the latter half of the series, but then how did the characters hold up? Well, and okay, I'll be a little more specific this time. I did think that we had some great protagonists overall, but also some pretty lame antagonists.
To highlight this point, let's first examine the power sets of both sides, starting with the villains, and I'll just say it, the Yanida sucked. With a few exceptions, their designs weren't too creative, nor was how they got upgraded. The Witch, every so often, would just make a new, stronger monster type with little build-up. No other interesting mechanics like growing stronger because they have more fairies within them, or are being piloted by one of the generals. Just switch things out with a slightly eviler looking ball every so often. There was one more enemy type, the Kawasundan, that was used during Annette's era, and then used in the present by Butler at the end of the series. Again, an element I'm pretty sure was mostly cut. Thankfully, our main heroines held up much better, for the most part. Sure, some of their power-ups are kind of out there, in that even if they are trying to be over the top, I fail to see how tap dancing barefooted is supposed to result in a pink elephant performing a rider kick, and oh god, that was a sentence I just said. But yeah, I also didn't care for how all the individual finishers, which look so much better, eventually got underused and reduced down to just being special attacks.
However, those are kind of minor nitpicks, especially when you consider this was one of the more balanced teams overall, at least of recent memory. Everyone served a purpose, some more so than others, and they all kept it fairly consistent throughout the season.
Manatsu was the balanced fighter, Sango was the tank, Minori was the glass cannon, Asuka was the speedster, and Laura was the required white mage. Yeah, while this did put a little too much focus on the mermaid that we'll discuss more in the character section, I do kind of like that they at least kept things consistent with this rule that they needed to recover the motivation energy before they defeated the monsters, and that only one person could operate the aquapot. The fact that they dedicated a whole episode to this did prove that they were all in on this gimmick.
Thus, it is the kind of blatant, toyetic advert that I don't mind, as they did properly work it into the story, and did make it obtrusive like.
Rangers, you've now unlocked new modes that have never been seen before on this planet.
Moving on to the characters, and starting with the villains as usual, while there were some bright spots, overall these baddies were kind of underwhelming. As I said, much of the witch's motivations and backstory only really came at the tail end of the series, and while her conflict with Annette was good in concept, it didn't really work for me, as ultimately she just spent most of the series in bed letting everyone else do the work, and then we get this sudden mood whiplash through her entire backstory being dumped onto us, saying that we should actually feel bad for this character in the same episode where she finally passes on. I will give her some leeway, as it was clear that she was never meant to be like the final boss of the series, we'll get to that, but I will say again, there's a lot of untapped potential here with such a good conceptual backstory. Moving on to the generals, I think I'll just group Chongye and Numeri together because they share similar strengths and weaknesses, which are also reflective of these antagonists in general. On the one hand, I do kind of like the gimmick that they're mostly just punch clock villains who aren't exactly vindictive or anything, and yet sometimes they will become more aggressive because of a certain someone, which does lead to some interesting developments as I mentioned in episode 10. The problem is that they also often just reset back to normal in the next episode, and the cycle just restarts, and after a while it becomes repetitive. Numeri especially is a very flat character, never doing much more than just attack and check on her patient without showing much concern for her health. Shouldn't you at least be worried about her developing bed sores? Chongye, by the end, does become a little more active by almost rebelling against the witch's desires of destroying the world, and then just gets shut up by Butler. Yeah, I think my biggest overall problem with these villains is how inactive they are, not really finding the precure themselves outside of one encounter in episode 17. They did eventually use the attacks we saw in the opening after they pulled their face turns in the final battle. So yeah, bad in generals these guys aren't, and while I won't hold them up to the gold standard of precure villains in my opinion, I do at least wish they had a little more consistent characterization and weren't just...
Hello, George. Hello, Sam.
Fortunately, these two were kind of held up by, ironically enough, the most developed member of this trio, Elda.
Obviously, I'm not referring to her physically, so don't take that the wrong way, officer.
But yeah, she was by far the most interesting antagonist, mostly thanks to acting as a strong foil to Manatsu. Both girls celebrated their youth, but one didn't want to grow up fearing what was to come, while the other was sprinting towards it with no real plan. The other baddies were also kind of loyal to the Cures, but this pairing was by far the most pronounced, with these two getting two really good episodes to explore this. Through them, we learned how Elda had developed her Peter Pan complex from believing that life was full of uncertainties as you get older, which, yeah, she's not wrong. But through her interactions with Manatsu, she was able to learn that uncertainty is just a part of life, and you can't expect everyone to spoil you forever, and in fact, you should return the favor every so often if you expect anyone to be around. As a result, she did become the glue that held the three generals together, and kind of made for an enjoyable little family unit. Sure, it didn't make them great big villains as a result, and I also really would have liked to have seen some sort of conclusion to that haunted doll subplot, but credit where it's due, Elda was the standout antagonist of the season.
By the way, that title was originally held by a certain Mohawk, but that quickly faded by the end.
Butler was easily the most legitimately vindictive antagonist of the whole show. Throughout it, he was clearly gaslighting his cohorts and forcing them to do things for the sake of the witch. In many ways, he reminded me of a slightly less creepy version of Joker, though he did have his moments, as well as a little of Goyan. Thus, I was expecting him to play a significant role in the final battle, and maybe even become the final boss, which he did, and yet, wow.
He's fat!
So, as it turned out, the whole reason he was undyingly loyal to the witch was because he had previously served as her knight during her era of destruction. No real deeper explanation why he simped so hard for her, just that he wanted to restore this lazy bum to somewhat of her former glory, which, if that's the case, why not just trigger her by reminding her of Annette, which he ended up doing by the end of the series? Did he just not want to discomfort her? Because even if they did succeed in activating the Fool's Casket, she would have just become an eternally lazy asshole on a dead planet, but I guess that would have satisfied this weirdo?
That makes sense to me.
And when that didn't work out, he turned into one of the worst looking final bosses ever, got defeated through the power of Samba, and gave up his motivation, which then just disappeared into the ether for no real reason.
Again, maybe there was originally more to this character, but wow, did they fail to capitalize on the only one true villain of the show.
Thus, as a whole, while the main trio worked kind of fun through their comedy and pseudo-family dynamic, as actual villains, these guys just fell flat. Moving on to the side characters, we have the fairy of the season, Kern.
Let's keep flying.
Like, literally, there's nothing good or bad I can really say about this character.
I think even director Yutaka Tsuchida admitted that they threw the seal in at the last minute after they saw the merge, even though, yeah, I'd much rather spend my money on stuff like this, as well as an Astolfo Beam plushie at a decent price. Memes are expensive.
So let's just move along to the cures, starting with Asuka, who also happens to bring along one of the only major side characters, Yuriko. And honestly, the story arc between these two were my favorite of the season, and made this redhead my favorite cure of the season. While many compared her to Sailor Jupiter, being the tall, bully-slaying powerhouse of the team, I was more interested in the many subtle clues that hinted at a troubled past between her and Yuriko. This was built up pretty nicely throughout the show, with the two clearly exhibiting animosity, and yet also an underlying respect for each other that we later learned came from them being former tennis partners. From there, we got a reveal that absolutely paid off, with us learning how the two had a falling out after an incident at a tennis tournament. And while Asuka did act rashly, she wasn't wrong to get upset and try to stop their opponents from sabotaging them. However, Yuriko also wasn't wrong to opt for dropping out of the tournament after their opponents countered by accusing Asuka of assault. Still, even with the assurance that Yuriko believed her, having no one to back her, but more than willing to throw her under the bus, Asuka understandably lost the ability to trust anyone. It was a brilliant tale that was not only, unfortunately, very realistic, especially for this series, but it also showed that no one, except for maybe the rest of that turncoat club, was necessarily in the wrong for their immediate reactions. What was wrong was both girls never putting aside their meaningless pride and just making up, even though both clearly wanted to, and thankfully eventually did, appropriately enough during a tennis game.
Even though I have chewed out this show for failing to properly wrap up its main story, I'm just glad that this little character drama came out as good as it did.
As a character, Asuka was just so enjoyable to watch. Seeing her slowly open up to her team and reveal more sides to herself, like how she could cook and was really into Animal Crossing, was engaging, and then learning where she was socially before the series made it inspiring, showing how bad experiences shouldn't keep you down, nor should keep you from mending fences. Minori was my close second favorite of the season, though I actually kind of relate with her even more than Asuka, especially as I'm writing this very script. FYI, 21 pages at this point. But yeah, someone who can be overly ambitious with his creative projects, I can totally understand going headfirst into writing something, thinking that it's going to be amazing, without realizing that I really should have come up with a better outline first. Minori experienced this when she got some necessary criticism from her seniors and didn't take it gracefully. And while this has been a thing for Cure in the past, I like how Minori's arc did also bring in some legit writing advice, like how you should try not to make your story derivative, and experience what you're writing firsthand if at all possible. Minori didn't really consider this, as funny enough, she was actually kinda similar to Manatsu in that both wanted to experience as many things as possible. The difference was that they took opposite approaches, with the former focusing on research, while the latter was all about getting hands-on. Obviously, you kind of need a little of both, which thanks to her team, as well as possibly the influence of her pre-Cure persona, Minori did start to open up to getting her hands a little dirty. Though for the most part, she also did remain the little poker-faced brainiac she always was, which did lead to some great dry humor from her, which is kinda my preferred comedy if you couldn't tell. For that alone, she was the most entertaining character, and the one that really spoke to me. Oh, Sango, this poor girl. I think she might have been doomed from the very beginning to fall into irrelevance just because of her very gimmick. And you wouldn't really think that at first, considering that one of the major themes of the season was supposed to be makeup, and her mother managed what's now part of a chain of stores in this universe. But then you realized all of the heroines wore cosmetics, and she wasn't even the one who introduced it into this series. Though even if she was, the writers just kind of half-heartedly incorporated this product placement, at least compared to the other actual toys in the show. So with that, Sango only really had her personal backstory and arc to fall back on, which to be fair was interesting, with her wanting to seek independence and her own unique cuteness in a culture that emphasized group dynamics, and there were some subtle hints throughout the series of her attempting this. But that's all we really got, as even what should have been spotlight episodes for her ultimately became more about the side characters, with her getting very little in the way of actual agency. Now, people have told me her ultimately rejecting becoming a model and remaining a makeup artist was her choosing her own path and ultimately giving her agency, which I can kind of see, especially after reflecting on how her first and last spotlight episodes were written by Hiryoyuki Yoshino. This was likely his plan from the start, with her realizing that there was value in sticking in what you already were passionate in and finding creative outlets with it.
Personally, I don't agree with that sentiment, but I can also understand what they were going for.
However, I think we can all agree the path getting there was kinda directionless, mostly just due to Sango not getting enough focus to build even towards the decision of going back to her roots. Just giving her a little more confidence at the very end doesn't make up for the fact that she had practically none until then. It felt as out of nowhere as her suddenly developing a new multi-shield ability that I think she used one more time during the final battle, and it didn't even work. Yeah, unfortunately this tank has also one of the most ineffective shields in the franchise. It's a real pity because I really did like this character's design and her VA, and wish she could have been defined more as just the nice girl of this team. Her little X signs ended up denying more than just enemy attacks. For these last two, we do have to kind of pair them up because again, there's little arguing that Manatsu and Laura, the latter especially, got the lion's share of focus, which came at the cost of certain characters, more on that in just a sec. But still, it was a very well-developed relationship, and more importantly, tied into the main plot by paralleling with the witch and Annette's tragedy. In fact, the two ended up experiencing their hardships even sooner, with one of them not even realizing it until much later because of the exploits of that little memory machine. As a result, Manatsu's hyperactive and friendly tendencies got a much more tragic tinge to them in hindsight when we realized a lot of it was based on an insecurity born of trauma that made so that she'd subconsciously believe that she might not see someone again the next day, and so not only did she try to prioritize a proper introduction, but she also tried to learn everything she could about the person so at the very least they could leave on the best of terms.
Whoa, this is heavy.
I think it really is one of the best tragic backstories in this franchise, as it does highly inform about her current personality.
Though even before this revelation, Manatsu was a very likable character, helped by Ai Firezu never going over the top with her performance, and more importantly, presenting her as flawed. She could get way too impulsive and not only overstep her bounds, but also place herself in needless danger. And each time she recognized this and apologized for it. Sure, she still did get in a lot of trouble, though some of that might have been more because of her lead cure bad luck. Because I wouldn't say she was an outright idiot unless she was written by Narita and then all of a sudden she can't recognize very basic metaphors. But yeah, Manatsu was a very good lead in my opinion, and with a little more focus, she might have been one of my favorites. However, a lot of that ended up going to her deuteragonist / the actual protagonist of this show. Laura, based at least on the comment section, seems to be a bit of a divisive character, with some liking or hating her personality. Personally, I am more of the former, as I do appreciate Blue whose personality starts from the bottom and then goes through some good character development. In this mermaid's case, she went from a borderline villain to a very amicable heroine by essentially overcoming her slight racism. Again, I think it helps when the character development starts from the bottom. Sure, I don't think she's the best example of this, as her base haughtiness was still there and as obnoxious as ever, but definitely a stark improvement from the beginning. And interestingly, from what I've heard, they were originally going to give her a bit more of a gentle, straight man personality to contrast with Manatsu's. However, director Sujita allegedly voted against this, fearing that she would be overshadowed by the other girls, so they went in the other direction, which I partially agree with, as we have had that sort of dynamic between the protagonist and deuteragonist in the past more than once. But I also say partially because I think they might have gone a little too far in the opposite direction. Yeah, let's address one of the biggest problems with this show. Laura really stole it, and often not in the best of ways. She, more than Manatsu, was the one who recruited the team and was required in almost every battle, which only became more prevalent when she became a cure, and would execute most of the finishes in the show when factoring in the Marine Beat dynamic. And while some of this could be justified based on her ties with the main conflict of the show involving the Grand Ocean, it didn't excuse that she was taking away attention and spotlight episodes from the rest of her team. Sango was an obvious victim of this, but Manatsu also highly suffered from this, and maybe even more so when you consider that she was supposed to be the main protagonist, and yet she wasn't even the focus of their corresponding film. There, as well as pretty much the second half of the series, she essentially became the deuteragonist, and as a result, could never truly break out as her own character, as almost everything to her ended up being all about Laura. And I guess to her, the mermaid was the absolute most important thing, which I'm sure made a lot of Yuri lovers happy. Hell, I will admit, we did get some good doujishin out of it. However, from a character standpoint, it did leave Manatsu as more of a reactionary character rather than a proactive one, with instead her fish waifu fulfilling that position, at least in regards to the main conflict. Though, as we've gone over, the main plot involving the Grand Ocean wasn't even all that well handled due to poor world building. And as a result, I think much of Laura's motivations of wanting to become a queen weren't well explored. Sure, they kind of talked about it in the aforementioned Snow Princess film, with her admiring the current queen and wanting to serve her people like her, which then really should have been brought more into question when she learned that the lady that she admired so much was upholding some very factious beliefs. But no, they just kind of ignored that and went back to mostly focusing on her being a literal fish out of water. As a result, a lot of revelations, like the fact that Laura will long outlive her friends, was barely touched on, leading to a very rushed conclusion and reunion with Manatsu in the final episode. I won't deny that the two were cute and had a fun dynamic together, but individually, they weren't particularly strong characters, and when considering the effect they had on their team, they end up becoming an argument for why you shouldn't just focus on what seems to be the most important thing at the time. So yeah, with all that said, why do I call this a somewhat successful experiment, and even kind of like it overall, in spite of its numerous flaws? Well, as I said in the beginning, it all has a lot to do with intent. Tropical Rouge was a season that never really intended to be the greatest. I mean, it certainly could have been much more, especially considering some of the celebrity staff they had on hand. But even then, I don't think they ever wanted to be some deep think piece, nor did they ever pretend like it was. For me, media I genuinely dislike is the kind that smugly acts as if they have a deeper message and themes, and yet often it's no better, if not worse, than what came before. Not to say this franchise can't tackle deeper subject matter, but when it does, it should go in with a plan and handle it with grace. But yeah, also unlike those stories, I didn't get the feeling like this was a case of too many cooks in the kitchen, but rather not enough ingredients in the pantry. It could have done a lot more if the staff were afforded the resources they needed, assuming my hypotheses are correct. And yet, they still made the most of what they had, producing some of the best individual plot episodes I've seen in the entire franchise, both from a storytelling and visual standpoint. They also created one of the most absolute unique episodes with that anthology format that I wouldn't mind seeing again every season as long as it's not too much of a headache and a half to produce. Hell, even when it was clear things were heading off the rails as the end drew near, I'll at least give them points for actively going into so bad it's good territory and ending on a glorious train wreck. And most importantly, for a season like this, I did like all the protagonists for the most part. As I said, Laura's Yas Queen gimmick did get overplayed. But even then, I didn't dislike the character and did enjoy a lot of her interactions with the rest of the team. And again, from a meta standpoint, it never felt like they were over-glorifying these characters as pillars of truth and justice or something. They were flawed and, ironically enough, had to overcome their own cases of procrastination, be it making amends with old friends, reigniting a dream, or making tough career choices. Sure, a lot of these arcs weren't told the greatest, as these two really needed to get rum. Not to mention, the antagonists were also highly undercooked due to the poor plotting of the main conflict with the witch. Thus, if I were to compare the season with the other show that immediately followed a disaster and actively tried to make a more lighthearted season, yeah, Smile wins hands down in every category in my opinion. It had more even spotlighting for every character, even the fairy, some of the best villains in the franchise, better comedy, Fujiwara aside, that never intruded on the emotional moments or relied on dead cliches. And overall, it just had better production in spite of its older age. However, I also don't think Tropical Rouge should be completely disregarded from the conversation either. When it did succeed with its narrative and visuals, it did arguably the best of the franchise, and while its overall product was just above average in my opinion, maybe a 6 out of 10, I do want this franchise to try and experiment with new things like this one did. Please, bring back guys like Yoshino who can deliver some insane yet enjoyably dark tales. Bring in more animators who can make all of the JoJo references. I really do think there was a great season here that was just hamstrung up by the toy higher-ups not giving them the budget they needed, which, while I can understand from a marketing standpoint, I think can also lead to a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And after the recent cyber attacks on the animation studio, things might be even tighter for this franchise. Thus, more than ever, they need to figure out their priorities and not let the lessons of this series fade away like a memory machine.
And with that, this lengthy little analysis is over. I think we actually might hit an hour, but I hope that you enjoyed it for the most part. As I said, the Delicious Party reviews will be on hold as Toei tries to antivirus all of its servers, but until then, I'll try and move a few things around in the schedule and try to produce as much consistent content as I can. Yeah, I think I'm actually going to go to that beach because, you know, motivation is important, but what's more important is some relaxation.